I'd like to talk inflation. Why? Because so many politicians use the term, so many people tie it to increases, for example, in the minimum wage, yet most people really don't understand it. A good metaphor for inflation is a balloon. If you blow into a balloon, you blow it up, it inflates, it gets bigger. There's more air supply in the balloon. When you deflate that balloon, air comes out, it gets smaller. That's exactly what economic deflation is. When money vanishes from an economy and no longer exists. And it can have devastating effects on purchasing power when things deflate. Now, for one thing, inflation basically is another word for growth. Deflation is for reduction or basically shrinkage. Inflation is primarily generated, though, in the market economy without any government involvement whatsoever. Just think, a single property could be bought by a couple settling in 1 year, and let's say or pretend that he or she, the head of household, pays $175,000 and gets that mortgage for that property. But that head of household gets another job offer in another city within, say, 2 years, decides to sell the house. And a buyer comes along and chooses on his or her own free will to pay $200,000 for that same house in 2 short years. The bank lends this to the new buyer, that amount of cash, and the deal's done. My friends, that's inflation. That's where most inflation comes from, by the way. Not because of any action government takes, but because individuals, private banks, choose to lend and purchase at a higher price, thus making the dollar less valuable with each of those transactions. Now, let's say that the second buyer, in our example, stays for 5 years and then puts the house up for sale. In this scenario, if it's a hot market and the third buyer after 5 more years passes pays $300,000 for this exact same house in this same period, the bank lends him or her the money and the deal is done. Again, there's more inflation. That same house in this 8-year sample, actually it's a 7-year period, went from a value of $175,000 on the first sale to $300,000 in this sample. This is a remarkable increase of $125,000. That's 72% higher than the original amount that we started with in the sample. That's inflation at work, guys. Folks, that's how it works. And what is not told to you, and the lie that you're sold as an individual, is that government controls all of this. The truth is, these inflationary measures are controlled largely by decisions of the individuals and banks involved. There is no master directing the shots. This is how our system of finance works. People make the choice. They are willing to pay that higher price. I don't know why, but they pay it. To blame the government and to deregulate the market and take government restrictions away will do nothing to rein in this type of inflationary pressure brought on by a very important matter like housing. Now, I'm aware not every market is the same. Some markets you will have far more stable housing prices, but in many areas this is exactly the type of housing inflation and how housing inflation has worked time and time again since the 2000s especially. Sometimes in very short periods, especially here in Toronto where it's went insane. Now, I hope this sample of inflation will open your eyes that it's not all government action at fault. And sometimes the value of the dollar will be devalued by deregulation itself. For example, if a bank were allowed to hand out 45-year mortgages instead of be limited to 25 or 30, just as an example, you could then afford a mortgage far greater than the allowed or the $300,000 asking price of that last sample. So deregulation of the economy and banks could actually create more inflation. When a government or a central bank takes actions as if they reduced mortgages from a maximum of, say, 30 years to 25 years, which did happen here in Canada, or they increase interest rates, like a central bank can sometimes do, that's trying to reduce inflation. That regulation is designed to reduce inflation, not increase it. The actions are designed to limit the loans people can afford and that the banks will hand out to keep prices from going too far upward. That's why interest rate increases are not always a bad thing. The increases put value back into the dollar. by not allowing you to pull out the maximum possible. If you're not able to afford as much of an interest payment, you won't be able to jack that mortgage up by asking a significantly higher price than that same house sold for some years ago. For example, instead of $300,000 in our last sale example, maybe the buyer would have been limited to only $250,000 if the interest rates were increased a little bit since the last time the house sold, or possibly even retain to the sale to the same $200,000 range to keep inflation in check. So in other words, regulation and government action can often help against inflation. Deregulation and being against government does not protect against inflationary pressures like a major sector such as real estate and housing. So keep that in mind. When people blame the government for all the problems in the economy, just remember, it is not true. I hope this video helps with understanding the macroeconomy more than you knew before. Too many people don't understand facts like these. And so many people have fundamental misunderstandings about how government and markets work and interact together, and how it affects inflation and deflation. Thanks for watching.